You wake before the sun, not because you want to, because the city demands it. Outside your mud brick walls, Babylon is already moving. Donkey carts clatter over stone-paved streets, bakers slide flatbread into clay ovens. The smell of date wine and roasting sesame drifts through the gap beneath your door. It is 600 BC, and this, right here, is the most powerful city on Earth. Using advanced AI reconstruction techniques, we've rebuilt ancient Babylon from cuneiform tablets, excavated foundations, and centuries of archaeological research to bring you inside a single day in the city that ruled the ancient world. Babylon stretches across both banks of the Euphrates River, the great river that is the city's heartbeat, its highway, its god. The outer walls alone are wide enough for 2 chariots to race side by side on top. The city covers nearly 10 square kilometers. Perhaps 200,000 people live here, a number that would not exist in any European city for another 1,000 years. This is the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar II, at its absolute peak. And today, you are going to live inside it. But here's what nobody tells you about Babylon, the part that changes how you see everything that came after it. Stay with me. Your house is small. Almost everyone is. The walls are thick mud brick, the same material that built this empire. No windows face the street. Babylonians build inward, private. Your rooms face a central courtyard where a single fig tree grows and a clay pot collects rainwater. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth, hardened by years of bare skin. No furniture beyond reed mats and a low wooden chest. Above you, a flat roof where the family sleeps in summer when the heat becomes a living thing that refuses to leave. Breakfast is barley bread. It always is. You wash it down with a thin, sour beer, safer than the river water, which carries invisible things that kill. Your children eat quickly and disappear into the courtyard. There is no morning quiet here. No silence. Outside, the city is building itself louder by the minute. The Euphrates moves through Babylon like a slow grey muscle boats loaded with cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, tin from as far as Afghanistan pushing against the current. Merchants unload at the docks before the heat arrives. Tax collectors are already watching from the quayside, clay tablets in hand, stylus ready. Nothing enters Babylon without being counted. The river has carried trade to this city for 2,000 years. It will carry conquerors here within a generation. But right now, the Euphrates belongs to Babylon, and Babylon belongs to no one. And what you're about to walk into the streets, the market, the gate you pass through every single morning, none of it looks like anything you've been told ancient cities look like. Not even close. By mid-morning, the main processional avenue, the Aibur Shabu, is alive. This road is not dirt. It is paved with limestone slabs and fired brick, each tile stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name. The walls lining it are glazed in deep blue and gold, Babylon's royal colors, decorated with 120 lions, bulls, and dragons carved in brilliant relief. If you've never seen color like this before, you haven't. Most cities in 600 BC are beige, brown, gray. Babylon blazes. At the far end of the processional way stands the Ishtar Gate, 50 feet high, brilliant turquoise, adorned with alternating rows of lions and aurochs, 575 animals total, each one molded from blue glazed brick, so precise that modern archaeologists could piece them back together 2,500 years later. You pass through the gate every morning. You've stopped seeing it. That's what it means to live inside a wonder. The marketplaces beyond are controlled chaos. Wool merchants beside perfume sellers, beside grain traders, beside scribes, offering to write your letters for a fee. Prices are set, not negotiated. The palace administers commerce across the entire city, and royal inspectors walk the market with bronze weights to check that no one is cheating. Wool, grain, silver, these are the currencies of Babylon. Coins won't exist for another generation. Instead, you carry small weights of silver, weighed, not stamped. And every transaction is witnessed, recorded on clay, and stored in temple archives. Here's what makes this remarkable, and this is the part that stops historians cold. Some of those tablets still exist. We know the price of barley in Babylon in 600 BC. We know the names of merchants, their debts, their contracts, their divorces. The Babylonians recorded everything, every deal witnessed, every dispute archived, every life reduced to a small rectangle of damp clay pressed with a reed. You are walking through the most documented city in the ancient world. But here's where it gets strange, because the people running this city aren't who you'd expect. The real power in Babylon doesn't live in the palace, it lives somewhere else entirely. By noon, the heat is serious. The sun god Shamash is at his highest, and the city acknowledges him. Work slows. The bakers shutter their stalls. You find shade inside the courtyard, but the priests never stop. Babylon's religious life is exhausting to watch. The temples, called ziggurats, are not places you enter for private prayer. They are machines for feeding the gods. Esagila, the great temple of Marduk, sits at the center of the city like a city within a city. Its priests number in the thousands. Every morning, they ritually wash the statue of Marduk, dress it in fresh linen, and present it with 2 full meals, breakfast and dinner, of roasted meat, fish, bread, and beer. Marduk eats before Babylon does. The priests eat what the god leaves. The rest is sold back into the market. The temples are not separate from the economy. They are the economy. They own fields outside the city. They lend silver at interest. They employ weavers, brewers, and scribes. Esagila alone controls enough land to feed 10,000 people. Babylon doesn't separate the sacred and the commercial. It never thought to. You're not particularly devout. Most people aren't in the way we'd recognize. But you observe the calendar. You know which days are unlucky. The 7th, 14th, 21st, 28th of every month, when no business should be conducted and no decisions made. The Babylonians invented the 7-day week. They gave it teeth. This afternoon is the 15th, a safe day. You have business to finish before dark, and when that sun finally drops, what's waiting for you on the rooftop tonight is something no one in Europe will figure out for another 500 years. Evening comes quickly in Babylon. The Euphrates catches the last light and holds it, copper and orange on slow-moving water. Boatmen pole their crafts toward the western docks. The riverside smells of fish and reeds and the particular mud of a river that has flooded and retreated and flooded again since before anyone can remember. The city has a curfew, not a law exactly, more a collective understanding. After dark, Babylon belongs to the night watch, to thieves, and to things Babylonians would rather not name. You are inside before the lamps are lit in the Ishtar Gate towers. Dinner is bread, dried fish, and lentils. The children fall asleep before the meal is finished. You climb to the roof. Here is something few people know about ancient Babylon. From rooftops exactly like this one, Babylonian scholars tracked Venus across 21 years of continuous observations. They calculated the cycle of lunar eclipses with enough precision to predict the next one centuries in advance. They mapped planetary movements so accurately that when Greek astronomers later claimed to have invented the science of the sky, they were working from Babylonian tables. Looking up from this rooftop in 600 BC, the sky is flawless. No light pollution, no haze beyond the torch smoke rising from the temples. The Milky Way cuts the darkness in half. You know the names of stars the way you know the names of streets. And far below, the Euphrates continues its ancient movement. South, always south, carrying the day's commerce and the day's waste and the day's prayers all the way to the Persian Gulf. It has moved this way since before this city had a name. It will keep moving long after the last brick is buried. But before you sleep, there's something happening 61 years from tonight that no one in this city sees coming. Not the merchants, not the priests, not the king. You don't know it yet, but Babylon is living on borrowed time. To the east, a new power is assembling. The Persians under Cyrus the Great are absorbing kingdom after kingdom with a speed that defies understanding. Media, Lydia, Elam. The empire is growing like a fire with no wind to stop it. In 539 BC, just 61 years from this morning, Cyrus will enter Babylon without a battle. The city won't burn, the gates will open. The Babylonian king Nabonidus will be captured, and Cyrus will be hailed by Babylon's own priests as a liberator sent by Marduk himself. Historians still debate why. Was it treachery, exhaustion, theological politics? The tablets don't fully explain it. Some silences, even in the most documented city on earth, remain. What we know is this. On the night Babylon fell, the Euphrates ran through the same channels it runs through today. The stars were the same stars. The smell of the river was the same. And somewhere in the city, in a house exactly like the one you woke in this morning, a family finished their lentils and flatbread, climbed their rooftop, and looked up at the same vast, indifferent sky. While 61 years away, an army was already moving. Babylon would survive the Persian conquest. It would survive Alexander the Great, who died inside its walls in 323 BC. It would survive the Seleucids, the Parthians, the slow retreat of the river, the long silence of abandonment. But the city you walked through today, the Babylon of blazing blue tiles and midnight astronomy and barley beer and meticulous clay tablets pressed with the names of ordinary people, that Babylon existed only once. And for one extraordinary morning in 600 BC, you were inside it.